else involved in the charity ecosystem to maximize the impact of what they do. I'm going to hand over in a moment to my colleague Seth Reynolds, who leads all of MPC's work on systems change, and he'll be chairing the event today. But I just wanted to say a few words to explain the background of this event, why we're holding the conversation today, why we're so excited about it. So some of you will have attended our MPC Ignites conference last year, last October, which included a session on the future of philanthropy, in which we were sort of exploring a vision for philanthropy in 2030 and beyond. The discussion in that session touched on several of the sort of major external challenges that philanthropy will be called on to address over the coming decade. I mean, not least, the long tail of the COVID recovery and all of the issues coming out of that, which, now in the UK has been made even more challenging by the cost of living crisis, which, is exacerbating needs with people in communities and really placing a kind of heavy burden on the charity sector to support people facing those issues. But then there's also challenges on a global scale: climate change, conflict, refugees, all of which, thinking about the conversation today, require a joined up and kind of systems focused approach if we're going to have hope of tackling them. And then there's also several changes underway within philanthropy of itself: the transfer of wealth from the post-war sort of so-called baby boomer generation to the next generation, which is expected over the next 30 years, and which we're expecting will bring lots of changes. As well as live debate, which many of you will be involved in, about the rise of open, more flexible and more trusting approaches to philanthropy, the greater focus on collaboration, focus on tackling root causes, on the role of diversity, equity and inclusion in grant making practice, and how to make grant making more diverse, equitable and inclusive, and make sure that we're including all the voices that we should be in our grant making. We're keen to build on the momentum from this conversation, so we're really pleased to be holding this first in a series of sessions focused on the future of philanthropy, with the first session focused on the important topic of the role of philanthropy in systems change. So I'll hand over to Seth at this point to get started on the content of the session, but we'd love to keep the conversation going. So do get involved in the discussion and the chat, or ask some questions, and I will share links as well at the end of the session for other events and conversations that you can get involved in over the coming months. So really looking forward to the conversation today, and handing over to Seth now.
Hi everyone, thanks Sarah, thanks for that intro. It's a good thing I was muted, and in a quite spectacular bit of timing I just managed to upend my coffee, which was just perched here on the edge of the table, all over the table and myself, which if you can lip read, you might have grasped that something, but I was cursing something. Okay, so apologies for that. If you hear some drip in the background, it's just and if it's just my afternoon caffeinated beverage, which I'm now missing. So if I fall asleep halfway through, that's also why. If you see me kind of licking the table at some point, you'll know why. So should we get on with it? So hi everyone, my name's Seth Reynolds. I'm the Systems Change Lead at NPC. I'm excited to also be joined by a special guest today, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment. But firstly, just to kind of outline the plan for the session, we'll be offering a bit of framing for systems change, and having a sort of a bit of a discussion into this question of the role of philanthropy and systems change, thinking about what those terms mean, and then we're going to be diving deeper into some practical experience of implementing a systems change approach from our guest, who I'd like to introduce now. So I'm very excited to be joined by Freya Bradford, who is Director of Systems Change and Learning, I think I've got that right, at Rotary Charities in Travis County, Michigan. So yeah, excited to kind of bring some transatlantic experience into the space. So Freya, please do unmute and welcome, and perhaps you'd like to maybe share a little about how you came to this work, just to start us off.
Sure, thanks Seth. Hello everyone. Seth, I will try to keep this interesting so you don't fall asleep with your lack of coffee. Like Seth mentioned, I'm Freya Bradford. I'm the Director of Systems Change and Learning with Rotary Charities in Traverse City in Michigan in the US. We're a place-based foundation, meaning kind of we're funding across a geography that's about 5 counties. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a little bit, but I have been with Rotary Charities for over 14 years. I started as their first contracted evaluator. So I was helping them to see kind of the impact of their current grant making and capacity building work, and really helping them use those results to adapt their approach. And then actually kind of accidentally found myself in the role of leading a shift in the foundation that started in about 2018, where we moved from kind of a more traditional foundation to one that kind of kept a lot of that traditional kind of legacy grant making, but also added on some systems change grant making and support that I'll share much more about today. So I'm excited to be here. This journey has involved just a tremendous amount of learning for me. So I'm usually not the one in the hot seat. I'm usually in your seat, kind of listening to others. So it's just a treat to be able to finally, hopefully, give something valuable back to the field. So thanks for having me here.
Brilliant, that's wonderful. Thank you. I'm very excited to have you here. Okay, so before we get into the discussion proper, and to also kind of make sure you're all there and awake, I'm just going to canvass some initial thoughts on this question of philanthropy and systems change with a fun, interactive Menti poll. If you click on the link that hopefully should have magically appeared in your chat box, right on cue, if you click on that, and I will do the same, and I will share my screen, and then hopefully we will be able to we'll be able to do some sort of live polling, and hopefully be able to see what happens. So fingers crossed, the first question that you should be seeing is this one. To what extent do you, mine's frozen. Colleagues, is that working? To what extent are you seeing the right one? Okay, great. This is just some opening questions just to start us off. Not spend too long. To what extent do you associate philanthropy with systems change? I can see that we've had 13 respondents. I'm not sure how many, Gillian, how many we've got, if you can have a quick glance down the participant numbers.
Still waiting on a couple more.
Well, I'm going to move on to the second question. I can join to the next one. Okay, so then your next question is, how much would you say philanthropy currently contributes to changing systems? Not at all. A bit. Sometimes. A lot. Something in the middle. Hovering down the lower end, definitely below 50%. I think it goes up to 5. Yeah, I think we're at 2.2 out of 5. Okay, stayed around that level. So the next question is just a kind of brief open text question. It just asks you to give a brief reason for your answer. So it sounds like an exam question, isn't it? Just to get a sense of why you're, and if you don't think that philanthropy does, contribute currently to changing systems, why? Yeah, just a couple of thoughts really, just to give a bit of context for that. And hopefully they should appear. Sources of funding can be at the heart of the very system that is changing. That's pretty much nailed it. Ooh, harsh. Philanthropy is opaque, non-collaborative, competitive. Yeah. Philanthropists keen to maintain the status quo. philanthropy can play a significant role in changing how funding happens, which in itself is systemic change. Absolutely. Nice, bit of support for philanthropy there. Philanthropy is moving this direction, but slowly turning itself around. I think often philanthropists are not aware enough of what others are doing and what their place or their role, I guess, is in the system. While philanthropy should be leading system change, they're the only actor who can, but it's not happening. Not generally aware of the scale of systems change required. Many funders are risk averse. Some really, really good and insightful comments. Really sort of get at the heart of this question and why it's so difficult. So we've had 9 comments from the fast typers. See if there's any more coming in. A few seconds. Okay. Great, thank you for those. It's really interesting. I shall be capturing those. So, I mean, I guess I know what you're going to say now, most of you anyway. The answer to this question, does philanthropy have a role to play in changing systems? Yes, sometimes no, I'm not sure. That's pretty clear where you're heading with this. Sometimes. Brilliant, late surge for sometimes there. Fabulous, thank you. And then last question. Any thoughts? I think a couple of mentioned already. What systems should philanthropy be changing? I think this should be another open text question. This is the last one. Any thoughts? I'm not getting any results on the screen. Is there a problem with this question? Is it not? Oh, it is appearing. Great. Sorry, it's just a bit of lag on my part, or people don't like the question. Yeah. So yeah. So 2 thoughts on exactly how philanthropy itself, the philanthropy system, and how the philanthropy, or the how that system operates. Political and economic ones that feed inequalities and environmental crises. Any systems that are preventing people from flourishing? It's a beautiful answer. Okay. Systems that exclude people, that keep up people in poverty, sustain marginalization, perpetuate disadvantage, systems of inequity. So lots of thoughts on equality, inequality, big systems. Fantastic. Okay, I think we'll probably come back to the room. Thanks so much for that that input. It's really great to get a sense. I do like at the beginning of a session to kind of hear from people, get a sense of what their kind of current thinking is on these topics. So it's really, really useful. So we're going to start with some brief framing of our own, I guess, on this topic, and thinking about what we mean when we talk about systems change. You know, something certainly that I get asked about, and if one talks about these kinds of things, that comes up a lot. So it's probably useful just to kind of see if we can get on the same page with similar terminology. So, so Freya, if you're happy to, be great to hear your sort of interpretation or understanding, or, you know, how you answer that question of what do you mean by systems change anyway?
Sure, great. I'd be happy to. If we can have the first kind of the iceberg slide, that would be great. While you're pulling that up, we do, one of the roles that we've taken in systems change work at the foundation is to try to educate and build awareness around what systems change is, and you know how you might do it, some things, some skill building workshops and things like that. So I have pulled a couple slides from that work just to share a little bit about how we think of systems change, which you know, there are as many definitions in the field as, you know, people. So take this with a grain of salt. This is kind of how we think about and how we've applied a systems approach to our work. So for us, we tend to think about systems change. You may be familiar with kind of this iceberg model that's used in systems change a lot. I didn't put the full model up here, but we think of systems change as all of that stuff kind of below the waterline of the iceberg. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that. But most of philanthropy, in my opinion, our opinion, and really most of, I think, nonprofit and charitable work in the US anyway, seems to kind of be focused on the tip of the iceberg or the consequences of problems. So by that, I'm really talking about kind of, you know, addressing those visible, urgent problems, helping folks kind of cope with or deal with, or, you know, get around or circumvent the consequences of the systems that we currently have in place. So, you know, our systems and probably your systems over there, the UK, currently seem to produce a pretty steady number of people who are homeless at any given time, victims of violence, people living in poverty, food insecure. So these numbers, those big kind of levers don't seem to be changing much, but our sector has done a really good job of helping folks cope with that. But rarely do we really kind of get underneath the iceberg and really think about or investigate why we have those current levels of problems, why they're so persistent. So to me, that's what systems change work is really all about. It's kind of looking under the iceberg for the causes, looking at the roots of problems, and see, you know, why our systems are designed in a way that we're getting results that nobody really wants. So I think, you know, by being more intentional about the choices that we make every day, for those of us that work in the sector and in philanthropy, we can choose different actions, which then design different systems, which then hopefully gives us different results so that more folks can thrive in our communities. So that's actually, let's go to the next slide too, and I'll dig just a little bit deeper and then turn it back to Seth. But we've kind of come in our journey to really think about kind of systems change work in two kind of buckets that you see here on the slide. We think about it as kind of working differently together. And by that, we're kind of talking about bringing folks together, building trust among those that work in the system, some coherence around kind of a shared common purpose, and really doing that work of looking kind of upstream a little differently at what might be causing a problem and finding out where those points could be in the system where we can have ripple effects and kind of make more durable change, and then really experimenting and learning together. So that's kind of one piece, that's kind of the how of systems change in our mind. It's like we're working differently together for different results kind of across sectors. And then the other side, the triangle we've borrowed from The Water of Systems Change from FSG. You may be familiar with that article. It's really great framing that's kind of rooted in Donella Meadows and others' work in the field. And this is kind of, I think of this as like, what are we working on when we talk about systems change? What's the work? So we're working to change these things in this triangle. We're working together differently, but we're also working on policy change, changing practice within the system, resource flows, the way that money and ideas and inspiration kind of flows through the system. We're making new relationships and connections. We're shifting power, hopefully to those that are closest to issues, and then really changing the way we think about the problem, about the work of working together. So that's kind of been helpful for us to kind of frame it in those two different ways, the two different types of work of systems change. So Seth, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you. Yes, I do recommend that, following that FSG link to the publication. Is also a really interesting webinar that they've got in which they sort of talk through it. A really good discussion on it, and on the Collective Impact Forum website. Yes, Gillian, if you could go on to back to slide 3. So what I want to do is, I guess kind of what I see my role as often is to sort of not make it not scary, which is, I think, is important, and sort of make it accessible. That's something that I'm quite passionate about, and so I've written quite a bit about this, and I've written a publication, a blog about myths of systems change. So what I wanted just to share a few of these with the intention that, just to kind of think, just sometimes you should think about what it's not, and what some of the perceptions of what it is might be that may not actually be completely true. So if you just bring them all up, it's probably easiest. This isn't meaning to kind of contradict what's been shared. So the first one, if the first one here, system change is trying to do something fundamentally different to other kinds of social change. So yes, I mean, I agree with the points about, philanthropy often doesn't work towards systems change, and so a lot of activity within the sector, isn't perhaps sort of working towards systems change. The point I'm trying to make, number one, so I guess I'm differentiating between sort of attempts to like a genuine social change and more kind of, sticking plaster, kind of, alleviating symptoms kinds of interventions. So when we start talking about kind of policy change, some of the levers for systems change around, perhaps it might be advocacy, it might be behavior change, it might be policy, it might be, kind of collaboration. Some of the tools will probably be familiar. Some won't be. Some will be kind of, oh, this is different, this is interesting. But the goals, I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's not trying to do anything that other social change organizations won't also be trying to do: reduce inequality, improve social housing, prevent runaway climate change, whatever it might be. So sometimes there can be the sense that it's kind of in a complete occupying a different space and speaking a different language, and I think it's important to know that we're all trying to get to the same place. And on that point, so the second one here, we do end up often talking about the big systems when we talk about systems change. And I think it's important to bear in mind that systems change is an approach that can be used in different scales. So we're not always just necessarily talking about the financial system. I mean, maybe we are, but that can be quite. If we only focus on the mega systems, it can be quite demoralizing. It can be quite disempowering, and systems change as a sort of a methodology, as an approach, as a set of tools, can be applied a range of scales, whether that's a single prison, which is in itself a system, or the whole prison system. It depends on what the scope of your intervention, or your analysis, your inquiry, whatever it might be, will determine what scale of system you want to think about. So I would just encourage people to, in their own sort of journey, not to kind of assume that it's always the mega systems, and if not, it's not relevant. Number 3, systems change has an agenda. So privatization of the NHS would be a major systems change, not one that a lot of us would want, but undeniably it would be a big change to how that system operates. So it's important to kind of, system change is often associated with, like, I don't know, particular. So we'll talk about, changing the global capitalist system, or climate change, or those sorts of, big things. But any sort of significant change to the system is also. So systems change just means approaching and understanding change in a more systemic way. Fourthly, systems change is a fixed destination. So it's important to remember that systems change. They change all the time, and so that, because what we know about complex systems, complex human systems, social systems, they're constantly changing. They're very dynamic, which is what makes them unpredictable and therefore hard to kind of intervene in a sort of traditional, like, linear way. So, given that systems change all the time, it's a myth to think that it's a place where you arrive and you'll know when you get there. It's a process and not a destination. lastly, well, not lastly, actually, second to lastly, my favorite one, systems change requires talking about systems. Freya and I had a conversation about this the other day. So, which is not to say it's not useful, because, you know, these tools, language, you know, they reflect how mental frameworks and the concepts and the tools that we use, so it can be useful and can be important. I just, you know, I think it's also important to people understand that you know, saying it isn't a prerequisite to doing it. That is not, that unless you sort of speak the special language that's like, will unlock the keys, you won't, you haven't got a chance. Like, people can and do change systems all the time without ever using that word. You know, Mandela, for example, I'm sure never spoke about systems change, but was a very effective systems change leader. And then lastly, systems need changing because they don't work. So this is, I think, a nuanced point that's useful. I hear all the time that, oh, the system's broken, the system doesn't work. You know, all systems work for someone in some way. They all produce an output of some kind. As Freya said, you know, perhaps those outputs and those outcomes are not the ones we want, but we need to understand, rather than think the system is broken, the system wasn't designed by accident. So we need to, in order to understand how to change it, we need to understand who it's working for, who it isn't working for, how it is, how it isn't, who it needs to work better for, and how, and then design it accordingly, you know, get different outcomes and different outputs. So that's my sort of quick offering, I guess, to help to frame this conversation around systems change, which yeah, hopefully serves to kind of, well, I guess my kind of objectives is to try and kind of make it demythify, I suppose, and make it accessible, and make you feel like, okay, this is something that I think I can get involved with. So if you, yeah, I think you can stop the screen share now, and we're just going to have a bit of a further discussion with the panel. I meant to apologies, I forgot the apology in the excitement of throwing my coffee everywhere. I forgot to mention that the second guest who we said who was supposed to be joining us, Louise Armstrong, wasn't able to join. Louise was actually part of the team that Freya works with at Forum for the Future on their own sort of learning journey around this. And Louise is sort of freelance systems change facilitator and was going to be joining, sharing her insights, but has got COVID, so cannot. So let's return, I think, to the question that was raised in the Menti poll, the point that was raised, which was the first question that I had, I wanted to come to, which is about the role of resource itself, as in philanthropy. So if we think about this question of resource and philanthropy just being a form of resource flow around a system, if we're looking for systemic change, do we need to think differently about how resource flows in our systems? And what's philanthropy's role in how we think about that? You know, so because I think perhaps people, you know, there might be sort of this idea that it's just about funding different things or funding in a different way. Is it deeper than that? You know, do we need to think differently about you know, philanthropy? Excuse me, the relationship between philanthropy and resource, and how that affects the system that it works in. So I wondered if, Freya, I could kind of come to you with any thoughts you might have about that big question.
No, yeah, absolutely, Seth. And it is a big question. And I will say, as I was reflecting on this before today, it really came to me that the folks that I've worked with in the UK seem to be a little bit ahead of the US in this thinking. The first time I heard this kind of thinking that, you know what, philanthropy needs to completely shift in order to work in the systems change field, came from my work through Forum for the Future. So it was, it's not something I hear in the US as much. It's something that we came to, I think, on our own, really painfully, I guess, at the foundation. So I think that we thought, just like what you were saying, that, you know, we just need to make a little tweak to our strategy so that we can fund some different things in this systems change realm. And that will be fairly painless. We've done it before. And really, the more we got into it, the more we kind of realized that it meant all of these things that we were learning about systems change and systems mindset and thinking and acting and behaving differently. We started by thinking, oh, it's something that those folks, our grantees, need to do. You know? And then slowly we're like, oh, you know what, we need to do that too. And this process that we're going through to make this shift is really a systems change project in and of itself, even if we're just thinking about the system, our own little system of funding. I mean, literally everything in our foundation needed to change to accommodate this work. And that's not to scare anybody. It may not be that way for everyone, but we ended up changing branding and our grants management system, a lot of really kind of tactical, practical things, as well as just, you know, deep-seated mindsets. So, but back to your question, Seth, I do think we are messing with resource flows, right, as funders. So there's a box kind of in that model that's about how resources flow in a system. It's not all about us for sure, but we are a great input into kind of these systems. But we're more than an input. We're really a part of these systems that we're trying to change too. We're a part of the system. We need to act as a part of the system. And in the US, often, I think foundations are pretty far removed from those folks that they fund. You know, we might send a check and say, good luck. We'll see the report in a year. But this has really completely changed that dynamic. And I'll get into more of that later. But I think just being aware of that dynamic, that we're messing with resource flows, honestly, whether we fund or not, or whatever we're funding. If we're funding, you know, kind of that tip of the iceberg stuff, which is needed, we need to do that. We are providing resources to a certain part of the system that has impacts on whether or not we can or have the energy or time or will to make changes in other parts of the system. So just kind of being aware of the fact that we're even doing that, I think, is kind of the first step. And then seeing ourselves as part of the problem that we're trying to solve and part of the solution, I think is really, really important.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wonder if it's kind of helpful to, you know, is part of the mind shift anyway, about thinking of philanthropy to think of itself as stewards of resource, you know, as opposed to kind of grantors of resource, you know, because it's like, it's my, you know, if you're granting, it's mine, it's come to me and I give it to you. Whereas if we think about kind of rather the concept of sort of resources with it, you know, there's a resource flow within the system, and what's, you know, what is the, yeah, what's the mind shift that's required, and how does that affect? I mean, you did sort of allude to, like, it changed your whole approach to granting practice. I know we're going to talk about the program and stuff in a minute, but I wonder if you could say anything more about that. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's nice. I haven't thought of that. As you know, as stewards of the resources before, and I like that. I think that it's true. You know, we're not simply granting money in a lot of cases. So I think we need to be aware to, you know, of how we are resourcing. So we might be resourcing with money, we might be resourcing in other ways. We can talk about that in a minute, but you know, I think that the systems that we've built to respond to that tip of the iceberg really don't fit this work underneath the iceberg. So I think about things like, you know, competitive grant making. That this may not happen in the UK. I'm not even sure how your grant making kind of goes out, but in the US, it's often, you know, a really competitive process. It goes to the single organization that can make the case for their needs and their strategy the best, right? And so when we introduce competition into systems, I think, undermine kind of trust and collaboration and all of this work, all of the stuff that's required for systems change work. So we've had to think a lot about how to do grant making in a system that has many, many players, but yet our system is set up to fund one of those. So we could talk more about what we've done. It's not a perfect solution by any means, but you know, another thing I think about too is we used to be very attached to like measurable metrics. Tell us what your measurable goals and objectives are and where you'll be at the end of the grant period. You know, show us your work plan so that we understand exactly what you're doing when you're doing it. And that, I think, can really kind of undermine experimentation or emergence, you know, things that are required in systems change work. We don't often know where we're going, because learning is part of the strategy. Learning as you go is systems change work. So if we can lay it all out perfectly for 3 years, maybe you're not really doing justice to systems change work. So we had to kind of let go of a little bit of that, and really just ask, what are those first actions that you're going to take, and then ask a lot more about like, what's the how are you working together? What's your process for kind of seeing what emerges and exploring what emerges, and how experimental have you been? What evidence is there of that? So, another thing I think about too is that a lot of grant making is short term and non-renewable in some cases. You can't come back to us every year. We used to say that kind of stuff. We've had to like throw that out the window as well. Because that can create kind of, short-sightedness and attachment to like quick wins, which often look like quick wins in the short term, but kind of in the long term are not doing what they could be doing in the long term. So yeah, we've gone to 3-year grants. They're now renewable in the systems change space. And I'll unpack a little bit more about what we're doing in a bit. But yeah, it really did make us kind of rethink a lot of the way we were funding, and also kind of the other resources that we can bring to bear. So,
do you want to talk about those other resources? Well, I've got a few follow-on questions, but
Sure.
as you mentioned it, because when we talk about philanthropy's role, needless to say, we've gone straight to money. But that isn't actually, that's only, the webinar topic isn't the role of philanthropists' cash. It's philanthropy in general.
Right. Yeah. We've been thinking a lot about kind of the other forms of capital. Like we even use that word capital, that we have as a foundation. And we've been listening to what others are telling us. They're telling us that, money isn't really the most important ingredient, really. They're saying this systems change work, especially in the beginning before you really know what you want to spend money on. A lot of times you need different support, some of which we can provide and some of which we can't, but we talk about like our connection capital, because we have a certain vantage point as a foundation. We see a lot of the charitable work that's going on in the community and meet with a lot of folks. Sometimes we know what's going on where others may not be connected yet. So we think of, our role as helping to connect folks into work. So we might know of a network that's addressing a certain problem. So someone comes in for a grant. Hey, are you connected with, the Food and Farming Network? They've been meeting for 10 years and here's the person to connect with. So we do a lot of that kind of informal, kind of ad hoc kind of connecting, but a lot of funders are really taking on more of a active role in convening folks around particular issues. I've seen this fail more times probably than succeed, but in our region, we have seen some good progress. The United Way is bringing folks together around early childhood. We have a huge gap in early childhood education opportunities in our region. So they have taken on that role of convener and bringing folks around the table and really exploring what that problem is in our community and helping to strategize and fill those gaps. So we don't do that, but I have seen other funders do that. One thing we do is convene capacity builders or consultants or coaches that are working in this space to try to make them more available in our region. So we have a community of practice that meets, and that community of practice around systems change has access to now about 13 different coaches and consultants that can help them. And we talk about this as knowledge capital, kind of help them build their facilitation skills, or figure out their governance models, or maybe work on some collaborative fundraising plans, all types of different activities. So that's been helpful to folks. We can talk more about that in a bit. But the other interesting piece that we kind of blush when we talk about, but I mean, this is something that other organizations have told us, that really through our grant making and through our involvement at the table, they kind of get our reputational capital. So, if we have a fairly good reputation in our community, we've been around for a while, we give a lot of money away and have engendered kind of some goodwill. So when folks have told us when we're there that it lends some legitimacy to what they're doing, and it helps them leverage more money. So it's something that we're happy to do, and it's fairly easy to do. So that's another form of capital, if you will.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So going beyond resource, thinking about your kind of, again, the role that you can play in a system, and going beyond financial resource. I mean, yes, kind of thinking about how that resource is stewarded, and the way in which it's stewarded. I mean, I don't know if you, yeah, it seems almost, once you start, I guess, on thinking about systems, thinking about how the reality of how our systems work, it's almost impossible, isn't it, I guess, not to kind of then go on a bit of a questioning journey around that. So for example, if we know, kind of systems thinking is, like kind of some of the basic characteristics of complex systems, that they're very unpredictable, that they're very dynamic, that you have sort of multiple agencies and agents connected in really sort of really complex ways, each of which kind of having a bearing in some sort of way which is really hard to quantify on a particular situation, on an outcome. And all of those things, if you look at those things and you think about how philanthropy traditionally works, or indeed how most of our processes in the non-profit sector work, so it doesn't fit, does it? It's like, well, because obviously it's been based traditionally on the idea of prediction of, like, you, as you say, like the non-profit applies to, please give us the money, because if we because then we would use it for input X, which will produce output Y, and that will give you this change that you want to see. And obviously, if you take a systems view, like a very rudimentary one, that doesn't really work. And also that kind of whole concept of competition, the whole kind of, as you say, the competitive process, when you have, if you sort of think about roles in organizations of having sort of different but complementary roles in a system, then that also sort of doesn't really work. So, it's almost sort of, when you start thinking about the reality of complex systems as a funder, it makes you ask these sorts of questions and question everything that you're doing, I suppose.
Absolutely, it really does. And in those moments of just total uncertainty and like, wow, what did we get ourselves into? We found ourselves really just falling back on the learning that we were doing around, this is very meta, but I mean, like, around systems change and how instill in our mind how others were going to do it. And then we said, well, wait, why don't we apply that to our work as well? So we ended up doing kind of some exploration of our complex problem, which was, why aren't we solving these complex problems in our community, despite our best efforts? So then we mapped all of the factors that we thought, were contributing to it. So we treated our own kind of transformation as a systems change kind of transformation. And, we're trying to apply all those principles to ourselves, which is not easy, but it also gives us great empathy for those that we're working with and funding as well. So we understand the challenges because we've tried and are doing it ourselves in a way. So it also creates an interesting challenge too, that I've been trying to grapple with about, this kind of journey took 5 years and lots of questioning and learning. And now we've kind of, and I know it's not a destination at all, but we've arrived at a point where we have now some institutionalized stuff that we're doing, but we have only less than half of the staff that we had 5 years ago. We have our board turned over quite a bit, and I don't think any of it is really, in some case, some organizations have said, that this shift can cause a lot of turnover. In our case, it was pretty natural turnover in most cases, but we're trying to think about how can we recreate some of this learning and those aha moments, for folks, because it's hard to kind of explain how we arrived here, I suppose. So anyway, just one of our learning edges is like, well, how do we bring folks along now that we're here at this place that we are, so that they understand how we got here? So,
which is a question in the chat, actually. Apologies, I only just noticed that. How do you, Rachel from Foundation Scotland, asks, how have you taken donors on this systems change journey with you?
Right. So in our case, we don't have donors. So our money comes from oil and gas that was found on property that was owned by our Rotary Club. It's a really interesting unique story, I guess. Our club found some oil and created a foundation in the 70s. So we have money from that resource. So we don't have to bring donors along. However, we do have to bring 300 Rotarians along for the ride. So you probably all have Rotary clubs in your community. Ours happens to be, I think, the largest in the world because even though we're a small community here, I think because of the foundation, it attracts a lot of folks to the work. All of our board members are drawn from our club. So we have a tough job there of kind of keep bringing them along in a way that doesn't make their eyes glaze over. And they're very used to, probably in your communities too, really like what I would call like plaquable contributions, like something that they can put the Rotary logo. We all know the wheel, right? It's everywhere. And it's hard to show, there's nothing we can really put a plaque on here, folks, but this is really important work. With them, I have had some success because they're very involved in eradicating polio, as Rotary International is really involved in that work. So I've had some luck in kind of using that kind of approach a little bit. We can go in with, vaccines for all the communities in the world. We have enough vaccines. However, the problem is much more complex than that, right? And that, you can't just come in with vaccines. You need to do a lot of education. You need to build relationships. You need to build trust. So I try to show that it is, that a lot of problems are like that. So they seem simple on the surface. And we seem to have that one solution, but yet there's a lot underneath that. So that seems to have gone a long way with our particular club.
Yeah. I mean, I think being invited to speak at an NPC event is a form of plaque, right? You can take a screenshot.
Yeah, they're wondering. They're like, "Why are you speaking?" And this is the second one I've done this month. Like, the UK likes you. Like, maybe we should like you too.
We just think it's exotic and exciting to have Americans.
Right. We feel the same way about you. So come speak at our club. That would be great.
So last question on this topic of, this kind of broad sort of philosophical discussion around how sort of systems change journey affects philanthropists. Do you think that one of the challenges is this question of kind of neutrality or like taking a position? Like, so what you're talking about, this has required you, it seems, to take quite an engaged and proactive position, not just about, so obviously a philanthropist will be used to making proactive decisions about what they fund, and say, we think that the important thing for this country is, or this community, whatever is whatever, water, or whatever it might be, a community center or a plaque. But and again, this is interested to hear your experience and the US experience, but I think perhaps less comfortable with being proactive about how things are done. So like, perhaps they used to seeing their job as making decisions about setting their kind of parameters for what they fund and then responding to whatever it is that comes through, right? Whereas what you're talking about is taking a much more engaged and proactive and having a position on these questions and on the world, which is quite particular. And is that a challenge to be overcome for philanthropy that isn't quite yet comfortable with trying to influence how change happens, or perhaps admit that they do, I guess a sort of follow-on sub question really, they already set the parameters, like philanthropy does set the parameters for how things happen in terms of granting conditions, right? Mm-hmm. But is that the challenge, to kind of accept and admit that they actually do have a much more power, a lot of power than perhaps they're more comfortable with, and having to kind of take that engaged position, on how change happens, and how requires them to sort of admit they do have that power, whether they want to or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say this was one of the hardest things for us, honestly, because we have been traditionally a really broad-based funder. We fund across any issue area in our community, as long as you could demonstrate a need. And with that came a lot of love, I'd say. I'll just be frank, like, we were beloved because we funded everything. We had something for everyone, right? This was the hardest thing for us to say. And we didn't even move all of our money to systems change. We were just moving a little bit over here to experiment in systems change, because it did require us to kind of put a little bit of a flag in the ground, or to have a point of view, at least about how complex change happens, which we weren't about telling people what to do or how to do it in any way, shape, or form. So this was quite a challenge, and it still is, really, because we don't want to say this is the one way to do the work, but yet we do want to provide enough guidance and framework that we can make good decisions and that others can really understand what we even mean by this, you know. So we've had to put enough of a boundary and a frame around things that we can do the work, but yet not constrain the work. So it has been tough. You know, we don't advocate for particular issues, but we do advocate for, you know, if we're going to claim to be addressing complex issues, then we can't just fund at the tip of the iceberg. We can't just do work with folks that are experiencing the problem. That's very important. We need that work to happen. Almost all of philanthropy in our region is focused there. We're going to do a little bit of something different. So it has really helped us see, you know, like you were saying, we have to be a little bit, you know, a lot more engaged with grantees. Our program officer, we don't call ourselves that, but those that are working directly with grantees have a totally different job now. I'm one of those. We check in all the time. We sit at the table when they want us there. We don't decide, you know, we don't impose ourselves in these network meetings, but often they invite us and want us there. As a member, though, and it is tough to kind of balance the power dynamic at times there. We don't want our voice to matter more than other voices, even if we're the only funder of the work, which is a very difficult thing to balance. But all in all, I'd say it really feels much more like a partnership. And we've heard that back from grantees. We do a lot of we have a lot of mechanisms out to collect feedback regularly, anonymous feedback, you know, non-anonymous, all kinds of different stuff. They say it feels more like a partnership, that we're more supportive. You know, they say, you know, our success is really more intertwined. Like, I won't be able to continue to do this work without them and their good work. And we're really helping each other, providing mutual benefit, I hope, to each other's work.
Great, thank you. So there's a question here, which I think you've just spoken to some of that. So what are some of the different ways of working internally that funders need to embrace to support systems change? So you've talked about kind of having more of a partnership-based approach with your grantees. You talked about kind of having a sort of an agile sort of learning kind of approach and not sort of, you know, assuming that you know the answers. You did, and perhaps maybe this is, Catherine, feel free to kind of come in again and feel free to open up your mic with a follow-on question. But you mentioned something about non-competitive. I was very curious about this, because if we, how do you grant in a way which is non-competitive? How do you get away from that kind of a system? It's so ingrained, because effectively you need to make decisions about whether you fund X or Y projects, and there needs to be a process around applying and of some kind. So how have you found a way to deal with that?
Well, we haven't cracked the nut completely, but at least so, right, our systems change grants come from a collaborative group. Like, they need to come from a network or a collaboration of at least 3 different organizations. So, and often it's many more than that. And you know, it's still competitive. Honestly, it's competitive against other systems change initiatives in our region, but not within that particular system so much. And there's probably some competition for those resources that happens within that system before they apply that we don't see, where they're negotiating within that kind of around that network table how our funding will be directed. But we, the first year we funded systems change work, it needed to be from a collaborative group, but we did not require any kind of like MOU or partnership agreement or anything that talked about how folks were going to work together. And we learned that lesson painfully quickly. Don't do that. So I would say learn from us, but it's what happened in a lot of those first systems change grants is that the first 6 to 8 months of work was about them kind of negotiating how they were going to work together, how that money, because we still have to grant through a single fiscal agent, which I don't know any way around that, honestly, for us. So one fiscal agent comes to us on behalf of a larger initiative, where then the money gets spent in the way that they've described in their grant application and in an emergent way as things come up. But what we've asked for now is that they provide a memorandum of understanding that kind of outlines the roles of folks in that group, how they'll work together, how they make decisions. And there's no real right or wrong here necessarily. It's just a document that shows us that they've spent time thinking about this. And then what's the role of the fiscal agent or fiscal sponsor? Are they fully accountable for all the work? Are they, just setting the stage and conditions so that others can report to them? How does the money get out to others in that system? So they have had to do that. They do that now before they apply to us, which we've also realized requires some support. So we do provide consultant and coaching support to help them get to the point where they have that document. And we have heard back from folks that that's some of the most valuable time they've spent kind of hashing through that. It's not the document kind of at the end that is really valuable. It's that process that they've gone through to really help them negotiate the different roles around the table. So we haven't cracked the nut completely. It's complex. It's not perfect, but we're getting there. We're experimenting too, right?
Yeah, I mean, even that sort of step of only funding like kind of collaborative work, only funding some kind of multi-agency approach is pretty huge, actually. So there's a follow-up question. How long have we got? Curious about timeframes, size of a grant, evaluations of impact. This is obviously a really critical one. This is such a difficult nut to crack. Can think about the system that we currently exist in, which is very much focused on the concept of attribution of our organization produced X impact. How are you working with those sorts of questions?
Yeah, so for timeframes, we have 2 different grants, and we could, maybe I wonder if it would be helpful to jump to some slides, because I did some slides on this, yeah.
Because we've got some of this information, we can go through your program. So Julian, could you go to slide, I think it's 5, isn't it?
And yeah, I promised to get to that question. I'm going to do just a tiny bit on our journey first.
Sure.
Is
that the right one, or was the one before?
Oh yeah, nope, this is good. I mean, and we've already talked a little bit about us, but just to give you a little more context on how much we fund, we're not a really, really large foundation. About $1 million to $2 million goes out in grants. Well, I'd say 1 to 3 million if you count impact investments, which we do have an impact investing arm, which that's a different presentation. And this is not all towards systems change, right? So we also have, program grants and capital grants, which is another fun challenge where, we're figuring out how to weave those together, which is really interesting. And I actually started out thinking we should just move all of our money to systems change. We really feel passionately about this. But I'm so glad now that we kept some of that legacy kind of grant making, because it works so well when we have things that emerge, especially from systems change work, that are really tangible. Like, for instance, in our homeless youth initiative, it's a very collaborative initiative to try to end youth homelessness in our region. They identified a really kind of tangible thing. We need more housing for youth that are transitioning out of foster care and other youth. So we ended up putting a really large and leveraging a really large impact investment to create some apartments for I think 16 different youth now. So that has played a huge role, but it wasn't a systems change grant in our vernacular. It was it was actually an impact investment for a capital project. So we were able to kind of weave these, thread these together really interestingly. And so we also provide some capacity building support, as I've hinted at, and I'll talk more about in a bit, but you can go to the next slide. Just a fun fact on the next slide. So, and you can double click there just to show you, I don't know if this means anything to folks in the UK, but Michigan is the mitten that you see in the US, right? We're surrounded by the Great Lakes. Our region that we're funding in actually is, if you happened upon the new Oxford Essential World Atlas, that is actually a picture of the little pinky in our mitten, and that's where we are. So now you know. Fun fact, right? So we're really tourist driven region. We have a huge influx of visitors this time of year. So our population swells from about 300,000 to about 3.3 million visitors a year, to give you an idea of what we're about here. Big farming community as well, where we produce the most tart cherries in the country, maybe in the world, in our region. So lots of cherries, lots of grapes. But anyway, you can go forward to the next slide, please. Forgot I had animation. Okay, so just a real quick visual here for you. And like I mentioned, you know, somewhere along our journey, we started thinking about our transition as a real systems change kind of transition. So this is kind of taking that lens to our journey, and it makes it look like it was a pretty straight line and pretty easy, not easy as I've mentioned, but so it started in about 2015, where we really started thinking, can we have more impact? We really tried to explore that problem with the systems lens. So we used David Peter Stroh's book over and over, really, really valuable. It's called Systems Thinking for Social Change. And we asked a lot of questions of all of the folks. We're in our geography, we're right in the middle of our geography, so it's easy for us to kind of go out and talk to folks. So we did a lot of surveys, we did a lot of focus groups, we got a lot of info about like, why do people think we're not solving these problems? So we use that to make an explicit choice. And this is kind of a lesson that I would hope folks walk away with, because it's something we could have easily skipped over, right? We could have just kind of continued on our journey and kind of slowly changed some things, but we actually made a point that David Peter Stroh says, do this, make an explicit choice, because this work is so challenging that you'll often revert back to status quo if you don't have that flag in the ground saying, we're going to do this. We did it in a very memorable kind of way where we physically moved ourselves in a room. So it was easy for us in those challenging times then to point back to that. Remember we made this choice and we all lined up and we were all over here. This is what we want to do. So we had to keep reminding ourselves if we hadn't have made that choice. And the choice was kind of, we don't want the status quo. We don't want that certain level of homelessness, that certain level of food insecurity. We want to try something different. We don't know if it's going to work, but we know if we do nothing, that's a choice in favor of the status quo, right? So we don't want that choice. We want a choice that's not in favor of the status quo. So we made that choice and we started experimenting before we ever like created any grant categories. This was a simple thing. We just said, in our next year's budget, we want a line item and we want it to be to experiment with this kind of work. And, you know, we're not going to put a lot of parameters around it. We may not even we didn't advertise it. We didn't communicate about this. We did some experiments with folks that we already knew in the community were working in this way. And we learned a lot. We brought in a lot of kind of experts to learn alongside us and learn alongside our consultants and learn alongside folks that were working in this way. And that kind of became our kind of way of working that's continued throughout. It's like, we're not the expert. We're going to learn with you, alongside you. We're going to bring in folks as we go that know a little bit more, that are further along on the journey than us, so we can all learn together. So we did a lot of experimenting and then we co-designed. This is another piece that I think was really important. We didn't design our strategies, our criteria, our grants in isolation. We brought change makers to us. We went out to them in many cases and we said, what is this? How does this look to you? This is what we're thinking. And we revamped it constantly until we have what we have today, which has remained steady, but yet we do an after action review each grant cycle and we do tune up what we're doing every cycle, which we have 2 cycles a year. So I can explain even more nitty gritty for you exactly what we're doing. I think it's on the next slide. Okay, so these are the resources that we have to support systems change work. We have financial resources. We have seed grants, which are smaller, up to $20,000 grants for early stages of systems change work. So we see that as like bringing folks together, convening, kind of finding that common purpose. So we'll spend money a lot of times on someone who's volunteered to convene those groups and pay for their time. Sometimes we pay for stipends for everyone sitting around the table. Sometimes it's stipends for folks that aren't working in the system, getting paid, but folks may be experiencing the issues, closest to the issues, compensate them for their time. Like in the case of youth homelessness, you know, we pay a committee of youth to come to the table and help shape their strategies. And then $20,000 really is not enough, I will say. So oftentimes we do multiple back-to-back kind of seed grants to get folks ready to a point where they're ready for that Systems Change Accelerator grant, which is, I'm just doing a time check here. Yeah, okay. Which is up to 150,000. Again, not a huge amount of money, but it is for some beginning systems change work where you've identified some places in the system where you want to do something, you want to change a policy. So you're going to do some, you know, advocacy work or create an advocacy plan, or, you know, you want to change community mindsets around an issue where you might do a kind of a public campaign where you're trying to change the story or the thinking or the frame around an issue. There's lots of different types of work that we'll fund in this, and we've continued to fund kind of that convener or backbone kind of support role through this too. These are 2 to 3 year grants. They're also renewable. We've been at this since 2018. So we've had a couple that have come up for renewal and they've both been renewed. So that's good news for us because this is new. We've never done that kind of back-to-back funding before. And we also have some discretionary money that we can play with when new challenges come up throughout the grant period. So something unexpected happens, they don't have money for it, we do have some support that we can lend to that. So we also do workshops, systems change workshop series, probably like NPC is doing a little bit. We do support for an Acumen and Omidyar course that you may have heard of called Systems Practice. It's a free online course. We pay stipends for coaches and consultants to sit with teams in our region to kind of walk through that course. Sorry, someone needs to come into my conference. You can come in. Oh, I don't know. Yeah, come on in. Okay, great. So then we also have a learning fund that pays for folks if they want to go somewhere else and learn, and there's a cost to that. And then a larger Changemaker Fellowship, which is really cool, a larger amount of money. We paid for someone in our community, a Changemaker, to go actually to the UK to study with Forum when things were still in person. And then he went to Russia with his kind of practice team there. So we covered the cost of that. And he came back from his journeys and told everyone about how amazing systems change was. So it's a way for us in this kind of isolated community to kind of hear from the outside and not have it all coming from us as well. So we've funded 4 different Changemaker Fellows too. And 2 more things, we do a systems change community of practice with all of our grantees. We bring them together to support each other, even though they're working in really different issue areas. We facilitate that. We bring in some of those coaches that I mentioned that are in that systems coaching pool, that next bullet there, to come and talk about different common issues. But they do a lot of peer support. They share artifacts from their work that have been really useful. And we also talk about signs of change. So we share things that, you know, may be indicating a bigger shift in our system, and we talk about that. So that's it in a nutshell. That's what we have right now that we're able to offer folks. That systems coaching pool is the newest piece. It is a pilot, and the pilot just will come to an end on the 30th of June. So you can look for a blog about that and the results there. I'll put in a minute when Seth starts talking a little bit more, I'll put something in the chat that's a link to our website, which has some blogs that we've been writing and some more detail about all this. We have all of our grant questions and criteria and all that good nitty gritty stuff available for anyone online too.
Great, thank you. So we've covered, I think, quite a lot around your kind of journey and the learning that you've had around that. I think we've kind of got a sense of what's involved in the process, and therefore what would be involved in the process for those who are actually kind of in that space themselves. There was a question about impact, and I'm sort of keen to get any sort of sense. And obviously we know that this is a relatively recent journey. It's not been like 20 years that you've been doing this, but are you able to kind of what kinds of results, what kinds of outcomes are you seeing? I'm particularly interested in, obviously, in how those might be different to the sorts of stuff that you saw previously.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as you've already talked about, the time horizon on this is a lot longer than perhaps like a program where you're expected to see kind of changes in participants, at the end of the program. It's not like that. And this has been a very challenging part of the work, because we've done a lot of learning. The field, I'd say, of systems change is the field of evaluation and learning around systems change, in my opinion, has not quite caught up to where we need them to be, I guess, to really support this work. There is some work going on. There's some great resources. It's been a challenge for us to really apply those, but we're starting to do that work. We're working with Meg Hargraves from the University of Chicago. She does a lot of amazing systems change evaluation work to revamp our theory of change. But all that said, here's, we are using that FSG triangle to talk about our signs of change, like I mentioned, in that community of practice. So every community of practice meeting, we talk about signs in each of those areas. We're collecting all that information, more to see like pattern change than patterns across initiatives, rather than like any kind of like attribution, like, hey, we're causing this to happen. It's more, we may be contributing to this particular change. We have seen a lot of success in kind of the relationship box. There's a lot more folks working together on particular issues that are awareness of each other's issues, and each other's work is definitely changing. There's better kind of alignment. There's less kind of duplication. There's more leveraging of resources for this collective work that we're able to track, which does, by the way, resonate really well with our board. So our board, a lot of bankers, a lot of fiscal minded folks. So when we get to the point where we're like, hey, this, our grant to support this backbone and this burgeoning kind of network has allowed them to get to a point where they're able to leverage. They've leveraged 5 million from the federal government. Wow. Okay. Success check in a lot of minds. So it's not everything, but that is a good one that resonates with our board. And, they're supporting each other, they're sharing resources, they're moving resources around in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect in a competitive kind of environment. Like, hey, we don't need this. Do you want to do this part of this grant, over here? Because this is more in your wheelhouse. Like, they're making those types of decisions, which is pretty incredible. But, the two examples where we've seen the most immediate kind of success are really in kind of service system work, where it might not be totally upstream where we had hoped to be playing. We're not getting to the root cause of some of these issues, but our homeless youth initiative I just had a check-in meeting with them, and they said they are this close to being functional zero, which I don't know if that's a thing in the UK or not, but for youth homelessness, which means essentially that youth homelessness in our community now is very rare. And when it happens, it's extremely brief, and there are metrics around this, and it's non-recurring. So folks that do experience it aren't coming back into it, which was not the case when they started their work about 5 years ago. So that's incredible news. But again, we're not getting to the roots of why kids are necessarily falling into homelessness, but as soon as they do, the service system is incredibly well orchestrated now in a way that it wasn't before.
Yeah, it's about breaking the cycles. Like if you're managing to, as systems kind of reinforce their own behavior, and part of systems change and working in, sort of, not just in the consequences is targeting those cycles and breaking cycles. If you manage to break a cycle, then for the next generation, okay, the entire system hasn't changed, but you have produced long-term change, you know, through by taking more of a systemic approach. So that's really interesting. I mean, I have a bit of a personal issue with this root cause idea because when you get to the root, you find another branch.
Yeah,
that's the problem. Like, there is no root cause. That's the whole point. It's a web of complex interconnected causes. The problem with the root cause idea is that it suggests linearity. It's like, if you go there and then you go there and you go there, that you'll find another branch.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm keen, even though we did sort of lose out the second guest, we actually have a stealth expert in the group who I'm keen to hear from, because so, you know, so there are lots of sort of great organizations doing great work in this area, and another Renacey, who MPC work with on some place-based stuff, or have done in the past. So Renacey are a UK-based sort of a bit like MPC, really, sort of consultancy, research, evaluation, think tanky organization that do a lot of work around place-based systems change, and I wanted to give them a bit of a space to share their own framework around funding place-based systems change, because it's really good and relates very much to what we were talking about. And Beth Stout from Renacey has just kindly made herself visible, and I thought it would be better for her to talk, because I was going to talk through it, and I saw that Beth had signed up, and I was like, oh great, she can do it. Could you share a slide, I think it's the last slide, Gillian? We just got them to bring up that framework. Thank you. Yeah. Beth, do you want to talk us through this?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me, Seth, and just massive thank you to you, Freya, because this has just been the most interesting thing. I've been scribbling away, and so just thank you so much. I think, you know, when we set out on this journey to think about what place-based systemic change tended to look like in practice for funders, we spoke to a lot of different organizations who were funding it, and actually just hearing your journey was really interesting, in the sense, partly because it sort of reflects some of the sort of step changes that I'll talk about in this framework, but also just that reflection that everybody's journey is different, and obviously yours is shaped by, you know, where your income comes from, and actually that's a very, you know, it's not a source of income that we tend to see here, and so actually it's just really, really interesting to see that. So just thank you so much. So yeah, as Seth said, I just wanted to talk a bit about sort of what we set out in terms of place-based systems change. So back in 2019, 2020, Renacey was commissioned by a sort of a coalition of charities and funders led by Save the Children, to explore what it meant to fund for place-based systems change. My slight caveat is that I was not at Renacey at the time, but I was on the commissioning side at Save the Children. So, so this is a framework that sort of I was involved in putting together from the other side of the table, and it was really, really interesting to see sort of how we learned about what different organisations were doing. And so what we started by doing was just working with lots of different people to explore how they were funding for or were delivering systems change. And we ended up finding that there was a series of approaches that people tended to take to systems change. So, and if you look along the sort of the top there, so some people are doing sort of national charity programs. So, you know, that was what we were doing at Save the Children. We had a sort of a number of place-based systems change programs. And that's, you know, the case across, you know, if you look across a lot of the sector, especially sort of the children and young people space, but sort of a bit in the health space as well. And you know, that you get sort of a lot of place-based programs that are sort of run by sort of an overarching national charity. And you also get funders who are driving that themselves, or sort of resources that are driving that themselves. I think what's really interesting is that sort of seems like that's the space that you're in, Freya, in terms of kind of looking at how you can drive that. And then we also saw some approaches that were driven by, you know, a particular space or a particular building, or sort of people coming together around a particular resource, or sort of being driven by enterprise. We also saw some approaches that were just driven by a whole place coming together, sort of in a much more potentially grassroots way. And then we also saw some that was sort of an approach where sort of local organisations would evolve or would start to begin this journey. And what we found is that there's lots of different sort of depths of systems change. And I think that is a really important reflection, because I think it can be very easy to sort of see systems change as a bit of an all or nothing. And Seth, I don't know if this kind of resonated for me in some of the myths that you talked through, but it can be very easy to say, oh, we're doing it or we're not. But actually, you know, there's different levels, and sort of people make sort of steps along that journey. And sort of when I was looking at your the roadmap that you'd taken, Freya, actually sort of thinking about, it was reassuring to see sort of some of those steps reflected here. But people can often start out with that sort of intention and thinking, oh, actually, it might be, you know, a lot of people are talking about place-based approaches. A lot of people are talking about systems change. You know, what might that mean for us? Let's dip a toe in the water. Let's see what it would mean. Let's see what it would mean to do it. And some people approach it from a place of, you know, they might have been running a program in an area for a long time. They might sort of be a very established delivery organization, a very established service to the community, and they might start to think, oh, actually, could we do a bit more? You know, could we do a bit more with this? And they might then move into a space of sort of working in a much more interconnected way. And that could be across their own interventions, so joining up sort of what they're doing within an organization. I think we talked about today, there's sort of, we can think about an organization as a system in addition to sort of thinking about a place as a system. And then they could also move to sort of thinking about how to share space and assets, and, you know, what does it mean to share funding? And I liked what you said, Freya, about kind of people coming together and sort of, you know, being given grant funding in multiples of 3 and that sort of thing. And actually the fact that collaboration is really mandated. So sort of people might move to that space of kind of, oh, well, actually, are we sharing our assets? Are we sharing our space? Are we sort of really thinking about our resources in a very systemic way? And then that moves into that final part of the circle, which is sort of taking that really long-term approach. And so people can sort of make sort of step changes to different parts of the upside down rainbow, as we like to call it. And you know, that what it takes for people to move between different things, you know, might be different for different organizations. And that's something that we're continuing to explore. You know, what does it mean to make those changes between those different depths? And what does it mean for different organizations to do it? Because as you can see on the framework, it's easier for certain organizations or certain types of groupings to be in certain places. You know, it's easier for example, national charity programs to sit more on that sort of program delivery, dipping their toe in the water space. And whereas, you know, and Freya, it'd be always interesting to hear your reflection on this. Actually, your funders have that, are potentially already a bit more embedded in thinking about those issues around sort of mutuality and connectedness when they get into that space, just by virtue of the space that they're in terms of kind of having the potential to change that funding system and having that sort of significant influence that, you know, that funders can have. So I will stop there, but, you know, I hope this framework is, you know, a helpful addition to kind of what we've talked about today. And as I say, it's something that we're continuing to build on and to explore at Macy in terms of how it applies.
Thanks, Beth. Wonderful, thanks. It's really interesting to kind of to see how, I mean, and that you've looked at kind of so many different initiatives that are working in this way, and I'm able to see so many different journeys. I guess this is my final question and please do add any questions you've got in the chat, or just feel free to just shout. Is like, what's the actually 2 questions. So what's the one thing that a funder, like who's somebody who's listened to you talk and gone, oh gosh, this sounds quite, what's the next step? What's the first thing? What's the first thing that they should do to sort of, you know, advance their own systems change journey? Freya, do you want to? I don't mind either.
Yeah. Well, that's a tough one. I mean, my mind immediately goes to learning. I think starting really humbly and looking at what's already in the field around systems change, but also learning from folks that are doing work that they probably aren't even calling systems change, but look for where folks are, at least the way we think about systems change is a very collaborative kind of endeavor. So look at the networks or coalitions or collaborations in your community and look at how they're doing work and what they're challenged with, and learn and see and ask how you might be able to be helpful in that space. You know, what might we do as a foundation to help you do this work? What are your biggest challenges, and see how you can help meet those needs. The other thing that comes to mind is a really simple thing we started asking with every grant application before we even started having systems change grant making, and that's what might the unintended consequences be of this investment, which we had never ever asked before. And it was a really challenging thing for us to think about. And we asked it in a way that what might the unintended consequences be of either success or failure of this particular investment before we make that decision. And by investment, I mean a grant or an impact investment or something like that. So just thinking in that way helped us think more systemically about, like, going back to the beginning of what you were saying, Seth, about how we're messing with the resource flows. You know, if we fund this and it works, what does that mean for other organizations and other work? If it fails, what does that mean for other organizations? So it was our attempt at a systemic question that was easy to put on our grant review sheets.
And Beth, sorry, I just suddenly like made you a panel guest. Sorry about that. Just sneakily made you a panel member. From you know, you looked at lots of different experiences of trying to do, you know, system change or sort of whatever framework was used, but you know, kind of collaborative working within a place. What do people doing that need from funders? What's the one thing they need funders to do differently?
Good question. I think I would start with listening. I think I would start with really understanding, you know, what are people trying to achieve through their work, and actually what do they really, you know, and then what do they need from a funder. But I think it's also really important for funders to, you know, bring their own ideas to the table, and for that to be a discussion. So I think it's listening, but it's a really sort of active listening and a discussion process. And I think just that really collaborative conversation of where do we want to get to, and actually how's the funder part of that system too, and how do we work on it together
as partners, not just as resource holders.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great point to end up on. Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you. Thanks, Beth, for just stepping in and being willing, and yeah, obviously thanks so much, Freya, for sharing your experience.
Absolutely, thanks for having me. It's been a thrill. I love talking about this stuff, in case you didn't notice. So anyone that wants to reach out to me on LinkedIn or, you know, through our website and email, please do. I'd be happy to talk one-on-one with anyone.
Brilliant. And there's loads of resources on your website as well. There's lots of interesting blogs and resources that people can have a look at. All right, thank you so much for being. Oh, next one. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Plug. We have to do the plug. Sarah, Gillian, what are the next sessions? I don't have the dates. Do you have the dates? Brilliant. Next, here are our contact details, and there's mine, and there's Sarah's, and there's the tag thingy. Working towards systemic change. Oh, so this is an in-person workshop I'm doing next week. Tuesday, on in person, in real life, with humans in a room and biscuits. Working towards system. That's basically why we're doing it in person. Working towards systemic change. So this is the third in our series of systems thinking workshops, and this is kind of the in practice version of that. And then we've got the next event in this series around shifting power, which Sarah mentioned earlier, New Voices in Philanthropy, 19th of July. Visit thinknbc.org for more information. Thank you. Goodbye. Thanks everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks Sarah and Gillian for your support.
Thank you.
All right. Cheers everyone.